In the western turret of the oldest part of the Nomi Grimarcy archive, a silver bell tolls. It rang for 3, because the self-isolation of the witches ran on Central European time, and magic kept the sun in the sky, despite it actually being 11:30 here about the world. You're listening to episode 11 of Pulp, Surreal Stories from a Nearby Skull, an audio zine presented by the Sleepy Bones Detective Agency. The following broadcast is intended for mature audiences only. The castle sat by the shore on an isle invisible to the mortally inclined, somewhere just outside the modern limits of the Great Australian Bight. Not that this mattered, as fledgling witches weren't permitted to leave campus grounds until the weekend, and it was very much a Wednesday. Punctual as she was, Archwitch Victoria failed to settle her final class of the day before the chimes rang out. This particular time, on this particular day, meant that the Archwitch could leave her designated classroom in the 4th hall, go home, and have a beer in an hour. Unfortunately, this looming hour would be spent wrestling with the rowdiest of the 3rd grade groups the Our Lady of Palace School of Witchkraft had to offer. Somehow, she needed to carve magical history's vaguest dates into their collective amygdalae before tomorrow brought about the first day of the spring examination season. See, at the end of their first semester of 3rd grade, fledgling witches were tried and tested on their knowledge up to this point. Their physical capabilities, their innate spellcasting endurance. After sitting their baccalaureate magick and following a personal review, each student would then be allowed to choose their major discipline of magic. In comparison to Class 3A, whose chosen class familiar took the form of the traditional black cat, and Class 3C, who decided out of spite they'd pledge allegiance to the plague rat, Archwitch Victoria found Class 3B and their obscure yet blessed poodle-shaped guide to be entirely insufferable. Overachievers were the worst kind of kids. She'd seen many a prodigy grow up to misuse their talents and commit regicide or magical fraud. A quick scan of her caffeine-stoked eyes. At least most of them had the decency to sit themselves down at the start of the bell toll, but that had much to do with her 6,000-yard stare. Gloomy. Only last week, in a fit of misery, Victoria had bound the 3rd-year representative Stanley Steele to his stool with a level 4 Ocnus rope. The head witch had a few words for her after that, though she kept her tenure and her title. Her stare, however, only worked on 8 out of 10 students, and she knew from experience that her words would not be enough to quell these tyrannical mid-teenagers. Her mean streak had lengthened over time, and with a 3-week holiday heading her way, Archwitch Victoria felt it only natural to pull a nasty little prank on the unruly thing standing before her. A verbal warning came first, though it was done very much under her breath. At the snap of her fingers, Gregor dripped down from the rafters. Rather, most of him did. He was in delightful form today. Gregor was Victoria's familiar, with whom she'd heart-bonded with way back when. He was an Unus, a cannibal spirit who'd once been a 6-lined race runner, though he'd developed an additional stripe for extra swiftness in the changing process. Gregor had been running amok as an urban legend throughout Victoria's hometown of Raleigh, North Carolina, all throughout her childhood. So when she captured him in 1866, it made the same of her. She didn't love him, but she certainly thought he was pretty neat. How it worked was that, in his original form, Gregor had been overcome with some metaphysical desire, much akin to tenacity, which dictated he would eat 100 other race runners in the rather specific time frame of 66 days. The resulting magical transformation rendered Gregor nearly 7 feet long and mostly made of smog and teeth, with a ferocious hunger. She explained all this aloud, of course, as part of her lesson, going further even to relate the existence of Gregor and his Unus family to Nerslung, the saint of unending famine. Gregor's lizard skin hung off and around him in a most disconcerting manner, as though it bubbled by his own spiritual pressure. He could slip in and out of it at will, and when in a particularly good mood, it would puppet his actions. They were all in their seats now, if only to avoid Gregor's formless snout. Some were standing on their seats, and a few of them were screaming, but they all had their mouths open, so it was difficult to figure out which ones over Gregor's constant rattling. He held no ill will, Gregor. Didn't even like the taste of witch flesh. Worked a charm, though. His chattering underlined Victoria's words like a morbid drum roll, as she explained simply today's assignment. Cram like you've never crammed before. With a snap of her fingers, Archwitch Victoria summoned 3 4th grade students from outside the room, her resident nerds, and Our Lady of Palace's homegrown AV club. On brand, they brought along an old fatback CRT television. Still had the VHS player attached to it, though that would relate to the first lesson. Clark Cooper, being the public face of this merry band of total losers, and being pledged to Victoria after unwittingly causing a semi-nuclear catastrophe in their 2nd grade dormitory, took the liberty of ushering Gregor out of the room. He did so downwards, slipping through the floorboards. The slick, smelly vapour that Gregor left behind was promptly mopped up by second-in-command, Director of Photography, Adelaide Incas, who conjured up and quickly dispersed an entire bottle of Magician's Mr. Muscle across the porous wood, which didn't so much mask the scent, but embolden it. The third one, Apollo did nothing of interest, as per usual. Archwitch Victoria's 3 favourite wimps had been called upon to produce 3 short movies. As 4th graders at the school, the AV club had seen the most recent exam set, and they'd already chosen their major disciplines. Victoria assumed that they would be slightly more equipped to heave these deadweights over the pass line. Also, she didn't want to do it. Clark introduced their picture first, a brief history of witchcraft, a strict video essay performed directly to camera in the voice of a 20s broadcaster.
T&T presents a brief history of witchcraft, number 1 of a series, The Archwitch's Day Off, produced by Clark Cooper and the Tent and Tinder Picture House. Way back, 1606, our race is born by the hand of the embellisher of calamity. By way of 7, Sinisnix is born for the first time. In his passing, he returned them to us in the form of the Intrinsic Council. Later on, 1661, the Nomi Gramarcy Archive is built and witchhood begins to flourish. Out of nowhere, our Intrinsic Council is replaced by Belphegor himself. Those who served retain their strength, but their positions are passed to the next generation to better serve our kind. The ceremony now takes place every 50 years, though nobody quite knows what takes place. And who better to tell you about that than the 8th Intrinsic Palace herself, ex-Pallas Victoria?
Suffice to say, the Archwitch was less than pleased, and upon ejecting the tape, she crushed it with her bare, unenchanted hands. Immediately, albeit surprisingly, several impatient hands shot into the air with pesters and questions. Yes, she declared, as if it was a controversial secret when, in fact, many former intrinsic witches turned to teaching, and it was, in fact, a very noble profession. Those who have done, teach, she paraphrased. In terms of choosing a student to pick on, the Archwitch first selected anybody that hadn't said anything stupid for at least 2 weeks. Then, failing that, Victoria would choose whoever had the silliest haircut. Stanley Steele, with his family's trademark bowl cut, usually got first pick. "What's it like?" he asked. Embarrassing, really. It wasn't, he was. What is this, primetime television? Boy, she thought, she really wasn't cut out for this mentor lark. She shook her head and shrugged, as all good teachers do. It was strange, and awe-inspiring, and it left her mostly at a loss for words. Mostly, she repeats, because she couldn't remember half her service. If you are chosen and you have no say in the matter, you are overcome in mind, body, and spirit. You are imbued with direct access to the indigo reality's absolute current of magical energies, a vessel for your chosen major discipline. Think nothing but palace magic and the matters around it. Think nothing of your choice to specialize in the magic of warfare. Next, she selected the inconspicuously named Weirish male, buck teeth, alfalfa sprout hair. He, apparently, had somehow never heard of the Intrinsic Council, the divinely empowered, semi-centennially cycled government body dictating life and law of all which kind. He asked for a list, which she drew out on the whiteboard with all the enthusiasm of a vet putting down their second dog of the day. She explained, I served as your 8th Pallas from 1961 all the way to 2011 with Kronos Marni, who, write this down, is credited with the only second term in all of time. Then came the 9th Council. They and their major disciplines are as follows, she continued. Tartarus Solomon, the embodiment of our contract to Belphegor, in which we must eventually bring him permanently to our plane. Tartarus magic directly borrows the intense spiritual power of the remnants themselves, or conjures their physical presence. Métis Delphi, holding dominion over the material world. Métis magic allows us to manipulate basic universal fundamentals, a common tool amongst witches. Many choose to dabble in Métis magic alongside their major discipline. Thanatos Olive. Sat upon the fence post between life and death, Thanatos magic study primarily focuses on the practical application of necromancy in the progression of medical science. Pallas Maquette. A master of Pallas magic, makes use of fatal energies, as well as aid and abet combatants by spiritually rallying troops. Historically used for war waging, it was ex-Pallas Isabel to whom our school was dedicated. In her name, we strive to educate the next generation. Themis Alistair, the restricted discipline. Those who wish to practice Themis magic will find themselves beneath a mountain of paperwork before they're allowed to meddle in our reality's very pool of order or integrity to make alterations here and there. Perses Latika. Same goes for this, restricted to those who truly wish to dedicate themselves to the study of Belphegor's ways. Perses magic taps into the quasi-living force known as chaos or calamity to make outright changes to reality as a whole. Kronos Juliet. Forbidden by the Gramarcy Sacrament. To study Kronos magic, one is chosen by the council themselves, for none of you are trusted to flick through the folds of time. Nobody is, and doing it will incur the wrath of Salem. No further questions, please. We're already running behind. Adelaide produced the second tape, and introduced her own project as an exploration of integrity and calamity, told through stilted narration and extended extreme wide shots of the school's castle grounds, the artificial sun hovering at midday point with the seclusion field in full display, and an unexplained close-up of her pupil. 3 out of 10, all in all. The Tent and Tinder Picture House presents The Ties That Bind Us, or How I Stopped Worrying and Learned to Love the Grand Scheme of Things. Integrity and calamity, what are they? To put it simply, they are 2 of the many fundamental forces in our universe, designated the indigo reality. In this brief summation, I intend on comparing and contrasting these 2 intrinsic concepts and their effect on the witching world as a whole. Firstly, integrity. The grand scheme of things, though perhaps not exactly the way things should be, the living force of integrity keeps basic universal constants constant, and through the use of Themis magic, we witches can manipulate the preordained parameters assigned to our plane. Now, calamity, known in some circles as chaos, its manifestations often foretell universal anarchy and changes to the grand scheme of things. Commonly, the witch's allfather, Belphegor, is known as the embellisher of calamity due to his... Assuming this might go on for a while, Archwitch Victoria ejected the tape and pulled out its entrails so that nobody may suffer through it again. Question time. The students, as interested as ever, raised their hands at her like a nest of rattlesnakes. This time, Victoria went for the eldest in her classroom. At 17, Anita Beldo was on thin ice. She had only 1 more year to make it into 4th grade. Applicants over the age of 18 were referred to different practices. Not that they're no good or anything, it's just that Victoria believed in the system in place, despite its own personal bias against her. "How do we know all this?" she asked, clearly reaching her pinnacle. The Archwitch was certain she'd never asked a question before this, so it was imperative she gave it her all. "Books," said the Archwitch. How long have you been a witch, Anita? 5 minutes? I've definitely told you, you especially, the story of Sinus Nix. Before the Spectre burned out, it composed 3 tomes. The Codex Invocaverant, which sought to teach generations of witches to mold the world around them. The Iuris Scriptorio, which can unravel integrity. And the Transmutation Maleficium, the key to calamity. "This is all really dense," said one of the students. It was low-hanging fruit, and she ignored it. It wasn't supposed to be easily digestible. It was supposed to be stuffed just far into their thick little noggins that it might simply slop out onto the page come time to tick boxes and write essays. With that in mind, Archwitch Victoria pointed out the window. In unison, all heads turned, as though she commanded their very skeletons with puppet strings. She pointed, of course, to the western turret of the oldest part of the Nomi Grimassi archive, where a silver bell is kept under the supervision of, obviously, the Bell Watch. Another task of the Bell Watch? Keep those bloody books safe, and add a sticky little fingers like theirs. "The books are kept there," she told them. "It's why the archive exists in the first place. It wasn't until the 5th council that the school grounds were constructed." It was the goal of each intrinsic council to make at least one monumental difference in their 50-year reign. For example, it was the 3rd who drafted the first magical military, following the incessant and ineffective witch trials of America, the "if all else fails" contingency. In the 4th, there was Tartarus Pietro, who first managed to successfully force a remnant from the filter plate into the body of a human, creating the first Cambion. Come the 7th, in the early 20th century, there was Thanatos Honey, who demanded a once-a-decade switch-up of the infinitely expanding grounds. A spring cleaning ceremony, where the archive is upgraded with modern amenities and the latest technologies, so as to not lose track of the mortal world around them. "It's coming up," she told them. The Archwitch had been petitioning for the inclusion of vending machines on campus since before you had to plug them into an outlet. Before outlets, probably. She couldn't quite remember at this point, as she, like all other witches, had an estimated lifespan of, something around 1200 years. "What about the 9th? Asked little Sanna Viceroy, who'd been named as such because she was a child prodigy, and, as all child prodigies are, she was about the height of a child. 7 or 8, probably. She hadn't been given a student glossary, so she simply didn't know. Victoria had forgotten the question, and so it had to be repeated. "Oh," she began. "Well, last I heard, Kronos Juliet wanted to gently introduce the human population to our existence through time travel trial and error. We wanted to do it," she continued, "but we didn't have the budget. After all the nonsense that seemed to be happening in the world, what with the loss of the Eternal Plate in 2013, the discovery of the anti-human gene after that, and then the whole vampire problem in 2008, it felt like it might be time to just drop the bomb and tell the world." In an upset that would shock every member of the school's faculty, Apollo Driel had also prepared a short film. He was not what you'd call a classically intelligent student, often loafing around campus outside of class. He wasn't even a particularly dedicated filmmaker. He just might have been the only member of the student body who had any understanding of the post-production process. It was an animated feature, so were he not a witch, the manner in which Apollo's creation found its way onto a VHS tape might have come into question. He was, though, so nobody said anything stupid. He didn't bother to introduce it, nor hint towards its contents. After all, when she thought about it, the Archwitch had not given them a brief of any kind. So far, they'd done a fairly good job. Up until right now, this very moment, actually, as the television fuzz clears up to reveal our protagonist. Before the eyes of an entire class of fledgling witches, and a former member of the Intrinsic Council, whose history alone is hearkened by the last living angels of Indigo, stands a crudely drawn penis with 2 arms, 2 legs, and a pointy hat. Named in handwritten subtitles, he was the first intrinsic phallus.
"Once upon a time, there was an island of nothing. Then, all of a sudden, some very angry French people stole a boat, and then they found the island. Wild. Anyway, after that, they sacrificed some of themselves to summon a big scary fire demon. His name was Sinus Nix. He wrote 3 books. I have not been allowed to read any of them yet, and it is the only reason I'm here. Also, eventually, Sinus Nix exploded." When he exploded, bits of him was left over. We call these bits the artifacts of Nyx. Apparently, ages ago, each artifact could do something rad, like grant wishes and bring back the dead, but somebody decided that was too sick. I think it was Cronus Rani. They got sealed away forever, and then some idiot lost a bunch of them. Apparently, that's what killed Pallas Isabel, apparently. Safe. Thanks, bye.
A travesty of both art and knowledge. Enough for the ex-Pallas to conjure a miniature Salem's fist to strike down from the ceiling into the television below. It exploded in fantastic fashion, as expected of her own technique. Apollo Driel would spend the next 6 years in detention with her, she surmised, as she selected the next hand waving to her. "Where are they now?" asked Algernon Fintopple from the back row, where she'd placed him in an effort to never speak his name out loud for fear of summoning some unknown hex upon herself. While his voice irritated her, his question infuriated in a pincer attack on her mental stability. She found herself referring to her phallic counterpart as an official source. After all, he did literally say that some idiot, referring to the 7th Metis Lucci, had lost a bunch of them. "And we don't have them." "Well," she said, almost certain that she should bite her tongue. "I don't think so. At the very least," she told them, "they're not up there." And with a flick of her wrist, she carried their attention from one side of the room to the other, out the window, and towards that western turret on the oldest part of the Nomi Grimarsi archive, which exploded before her very eyes. "I did not do that," she told them. "I'm almost certain." An alarm started blaring, a loud, panic attack-inducing alarm that you wouldn't expect to hear in a building so made of stone, as though built into every wall were surround sound subwoofer speakers. In case of emergency, drop the bass. It was a sound that the Arkwitch had become very familiar with over the past 200 years, because it meant there was trouble, the trouble had been identified, and the trouble was probably going to get away with it initially, but there'd be an investigation, and then a big fight at the end. That's how it goes with witches, generally. They love a good detective story, but most of their problems can be solved with a clap around the back of the head and a good telling off. Still, the students did not move until told to do so, ordered afoot by the outraged Arkwitch, whose cattle shuffling meant she'd miss a good chunk of the action, if not all of it. For an explanation, she turned to Apollo, who was darting his eyes. A charm spell, he revealed, which he had applied upon his arrival to help entice a learning attitude. The Arkwitch, suffice to say, was not the least bit impressed. Worse still, when Victoria did arrive on the scene in the Bellwatch turret, she found that the damage had already, in fact, been sorted by a first responder, the good Kronos Juliet, who informed her that the Codex Invocaverant would need recovering, and rather quickly, if you don't mind. You have been listening to A Brief History of Witchkraft, an episode of Pulp, Surreal Stories from a Nearby Skull, written and directed by Jake Lucy. This production is copyright 2020 by the Sleepy Bones Detective Agency, and is intended for enjoyment purposes only. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, is purely coincidental. If you would like to support the show, please visit our Patreon at patreon.com/SBDA. Please visit us on the web at sleepybones.agency for more surreal stories.